Welcome to Dawn of the New Earth. Today, we are talking about the true meaning behind death and resurrection and how to find your true purpose, your true power, and be reborn. This is an incredibly important step. So we are continuing to talk about inner alchemy, and we are on step 5. Step 5 is where we leave behind the elemental realm and enter into the spiritual realm, which requires a step of death so that we can be reborn into this new domain where we can access our true power and our true purpose, metaphorically, of course. I mean, not true power and true purpose. That's not metaphorical. But with regard to death and resurrection, this is, of course, coded. When you hear about, even like Jesus Christ, etc., death and resurrection, this is all about destroying the old in order to create the new. And this is on a completely different level. It's going to be really good. This is incredibly important, especially if you've ever wondered, like, what's the purpose of life, or what the meaning is, or what your purpose is, or that you felt powerless. This is about how to unlock your inner power, your inner fire, your inner drive. This is the secret fire hidden within you. Very important stuff. And we're going to get started right away. But as always, hey, if you're not a member yet, become a member on this channel. It helps out a lot. You can become a member on Patreon or on YouTube by hitting the join button right below this video. You can get access to our Discord server, our members only videos. But what you can also get access to, which I think is really important, is my free PDF downloads on Alchemy that I have put together that are incredibly important for inner transformation, and gives you all the highlights, all the important things that you need to know on each and every step. And anyone who becomes a member can get those absolutely free. If you just want to purchase them without becoming a member, you can. I put a link in the description where you can just purchase them. But becoming a member is honestly better because you'll also get updates later on for other things like Tarot or Kabbalah, etc. Okay, so, also I want to remind you, if you enjoy my work, consider checking out my book, Psychogenesis. This is my 5th book. If you're interested in what we talk about in inner alchemy, you're going to really like this book. Now, it's not in terms of alchemy. I don't talk about alchemical symbolism. It's in terms of psychology, but it's the same idea, just with different wording about how to actualize your true self through shadow work, mirror work, power self work, achieving even higher levels of awareness through hyper awareness, and actualizing your will through will forming, and answers questions like what free will is, etc. There's a lot of important stuff in here. Okay. And also, finally, you can follow me on Spotify. The link to my Spotify channel is in the description of this video as well. All right, so let's get into this. So this is an incredibly important step. And honestly, I have a lot of notes for this. This video could be a super long one, and I've got a lot of notes. I'm going to try and go through it faster than I would like to, because I want to make sure that we can get it all into one video. But because this is a really key step here. So just as a reminder, this is the 5th step of inner alchemy. We've done the first 4. The first was calcination. The second was dissolution. The third was separation. And the 4th was conjunction. Each one of those was associated with an element: fire, water, air, and earth. Now, however, we are getting to the 5th stage, which is associated with the hidden 5th element. The hidden 5th element is spirit. And so there are 3 more steps. There's a total of 7 steps. The first 4 steps corresponds to a singular element. The final 3, however, correspond to spirit. All these final 3 are, so we're going from the elemental realm to the spiritual realm. And you're going to see exactly what this means, because it takes on a different phase of self-transformation. So this particular phase is called fermentation. However, unlike the other phases, there's actually a sub-phase in this one called putrefaction. So when you're going through fermentation, first you go through putrefaction, then you go through fermentation. So what is putrefaction? What is fermentation? This is essentially death and resurrection. And in alchemical terms, let me describe to you why it's called that. So putrefaction, which represents death, is the process of decay and decomposition. Okay? You can think of like a decomposing corpse. It's where organic matter breaks down. That's what putrefaction is. Fermentation is about the emergence of new life. So whereas putrefaction is a breakdown of the old, fermentation is the emergence of new life from that breakdown. Now, if that sounds kind of confusing, here's a great example. Think about grapes. A rotting grape can represent putrefaction. It's breaking down its structure. But this allows yeast to affect it, consume the sugars, and ultimately produce wine, which is the fermentation. So it's a transformation from the old to something new coming out of it. This also corresponds to the symbolism of the phoenix that rises again from the ashes of its old self. This is also what corresponds to the metaphor of death and resurrection in terms of like Christ's death and resurrection. The crucified Christ, the destruction of the old, and the resurrection of the new into a new spiritual existence. So these are the motifs that we're talking about here today. Now, you might be wondering, okay, why are we talking about putrefaction? Putrefaction is breaking down the old. And you might be thinking like, well, wait, didn't we already do that in calcination? Because calcination is all about destroying old aspects of yourself that no longer serve you. Things that have been conditioned into you since birth, false beliefs, false narratives, false understandings. And that's calcination. So you might be thinking, well, wait, didn't we, and very importantly, burning away egoic identification with the ego, burning that away. Now, remember, I just want to reiterate, you don't want to destroy the ego. In a bunch of systems, you're going to hear it said, oh, you have to destroy the ego. You have to destroy the ego. No, you don't want to do that. The ego is the center of your field of consciousness. If you destroy the ego, you'll be like an instinctual animal. But you don't want to identify with the ego. The ego is not who you are. It's just part of who you are. So it's about destroying the identification with the ego, not the ego itself. So for someone who hasn't done that, the ego rules their life. It rules who they are. You don't want to get rid of the ego, but you want to take the ego off their throne and realize that the ego is the servant, not the king, the servant to the higher self, which is what you truly are, your true self. In the Neogenian system of inner star actualization, we call this the inner star. Okay, so my point was, you might be wondering, didn't we already do this in calcination? There's two important things to understand about this process of putrefaction that's different. Okay, to understand this, I want to preemptively tell you that fermentation involves connection to your power self. Your power self is a very fiery part of yourself that contains your inner drive and your inner purpose. And it's becoming very close to your inner star, your true self. It's not your true self. It's not your inner star, but you're starting to get very close to it. So why am I bringing this up? The reason why I'm bringing this up is because you need to make sure that you have destroyed the necessary things that you needed to destroy, and also have integrated aspects of your shadow self and mirror self. Because if you don't, it can infect your power self. And your power self then, instead of being aligned with the purpose of your true self, your higher self and inner star, your power self can then instead align with the ego, or even align with your shadow, or even align with your mirror. These are just bits and parts of yourself. You want the self. So, and this can have disastrous results, because a power self that gets contaminated by the ego or the shadow can result in things like fascists, psychopaths, etc. People who are just totally out of control, but very influential and powerful, but wreak havoc. because they're serving themselves or their shadow, not their true self, but their egoic self. Okay, so what putrefaction is about making sure, the reason why this stage is different than calcination, it's like calcination on another level. The reason why this one is different is because we've done 4 steps. We've done calcination, dissolution, separation, and conjunction. And this involves, burning away certain identities, understanding what you really are, doing shadow work, during mirror work, at least getting that started. You're never going to complete shadow and mirror work, by the way. You just want to at least get it going, get it started. So you've done all that to a certain degree. So the thing is when you get to this point, you can start to become sort of full of yourself. And this happens a lot in the occult. I see this a lot where people are like, oh, look at me. I am so enlightened. I have done all this work. I have done all this shadow work. I've done all this mirror. I am so powerful. Now, there's nothing wrong with having pride in your accomplishments. That's fine. That's healthy to a degree. To a degree, that's healthy. But you want to be proud of yourself. But if you start to let that then inflate your ego such that you are now thinking that you're better than others, which happens a lot. And I see like in occult systems where it's like, oh, I am the Grand Master, blah, 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 of the 48th degree of the, Inspector General, blah, blah. And then people start thinking that they're better than other people. And then a lot of manipulation happens. That's not good. And that's where either ego identification or the shadow or the mirror can infect that power self. So what putrefaction is about sort of doing a double check. Because you already did calcination and dissolution, but now it's about like checking again. Okay, I'm sort of checking myself here. I want to make sure that I am in this for the right reasons, that my ego isn't getting inflated, and that I have begun to integrate the shadow and mirror. And this is all in preparation for your rebirth and the actualization of your power self. So that phoenix rising from the ashes, that fiery phoenix, represents the fire of your power self. Your power self is your inner fire, your inner drive. We're going to talk more about that. Oh man, I'm going to have to go faster here. If any of this sounds a little confusing, don't worry. It'll all become clear as we go along and explain. But long story short, putrefaction is the phase of making sure that you haven't had an inflated ego. And if you have, getting rid of that, the inflation part, not the entire ego, but the inflated aspect, as well as making sure that you are integrating your shadow self and your mirror self. So making sure your ego's not inflated, just letting that decay, if that is the case, in putrefaction. And then as well, making sure that you have begun integration in the shadow self and mirror self. That is what putrefaction is. And then fermentation is going to be about connecting to your power self, actualizing your power self, so the putrefaction is like the ashes, and the fermentation is the phoenix, the fiery phoenix that rises from the ashes and stepping into your power self. Okay? So let's see. Before fermentation, a person can feel sad and unmotivated. This is like someone who think, oh, I don't know what my purpose is. I feel like life is meaningless. This is someone who has not gone through the process of fermentation. When you do go through the process of fermentation, you feel alive and you feel a sense of purpose and a connection to something divine. Because we're going to see the power self isn't just about like everyday sort of purpose. That would be more like an egoic sort of thing. But this is about understanding your divine purpose, your true will. Because remember, we're in the spiritual domain here. So it's about understanding your purpose in terms of the inner star of your true self, not in terms of like just an egoic desire or something of that nature. So it makes you feel alive, makes you feel purposeful and connected to that divine realm. Okay. So let's see here. Let's start to unpack this. So putrefaction is related to the planet Mercury. Now, the reason why that putrefaction, or I'm sorry, I see, fermentation is related to Mercury. Now, remember, fermentation is a step. It's the fifth step. So fermentation refers to both putrefaction and fermentation. I know it's kind of confusing, but when I refer to fermentation as the step, it contains within it both putrefaction and fermentation. Putrefaction is like the prerequisite for fermentation. So Mercury stands for this. Now, why is that the case? Why is it Mercury? Well, when we talk about Mercury here, we're talking about Mercury governs communication and it governs intellect. So, and in Greek mythology, Mercury is related to Hermes. So before I explain why that's important, let me bring in the other elements to this, and then we'll see how they all connect, because it might seem a little disjointed right now, okay? But once we have all the symbols out, it'll make sense how they all connect. So the planet associated with this step is Mercury. What is the metal associated with this step? Also Mercury. So I don't know if you guys can see this, but this is Mercury. Now, Mercury is toxic, so don't be messing around with it. But this is Mercury, and Mercury is a liquid metal. And we're going to see why that's important in just a second. And remember, we usually have an element here, but this is beyond the standard elemental domain. This is the fifth element of spirit. So we're in the domain basically of the planet Mercury, the metal Mercury, and the fifth element of spirit that's going to be there for the next phases. Now, because we're now beyond the elemental realm, what we are going to be working with in the next three phases are the primes. So the primes are Mercury, sulfur, and salt, okay? These are the three primes. These are what we're going to be working with. Now, in this step, we will not be working with salt. That's going to come in later. So what you're going to see is that this step of fermentation is about unifying Mercury and sulfur. That's what this step is all about, unifying Mercury and sulfur. So what does Mercury represent here? Well, Mercury essentially represents the soul, and sulfur represents spirit. Now, here's something that's a little confusing. There's the fifth element spirit, and then there's sulfur as spirit. Now, they're not the same thing, okay? And I know it's a little confusing, but I didn't make this up. So the fifth element of spirit is what binds everything together, okay? Which is different. Now, when we're talking about, that's not what I'm looking for. If we're talking about the prime of sulfur, that's also called spirit, but it's different. When we're talking about the element of spirit as the fifth element, it's the pure essence of existence, the substrate of reality that underlies everything. It's the unifying force that binds all the elements together: earth, water, air, and fire. It's the breath of life, the eternal self. It's the fundamental stuff of existence. That is what the element of spirit is. Now, when we are talking about the prime of sulfur, oh, and by the way, here is sulfur. And we already have Mercury, but we have the prime of Mercury as well. This is Mercury. And I think you can see that it is a liquid here. So now there is a lot to this step. So remember, if this feels a little like a lot of information and kind of confusing, don't worry, there's a lot in this step, but it's going to, because we're going to be working with these primes for the next three steps. So it's a lot to take in, but it's going to allow you to easily understand the next steps as well. Okay. So let's talk about what this means here. So remember, this step is about fusing or uniting Mercury and sulfur, which means uniting soul and spirit. This represents soul. This represents spirit. So what's the difference? What's the difference between soul and spirit in terms of these primes? Well, in terms of these primes, you can think of soul or Mercury as representing the mind. It represents the mind. It's also imagination. Now you might be thinking, wait, didn't air represent the mind? Isn't air the mind? The air is the intellect. So air represents left brain functions. However, Mercury is the mind itself. So both left brain and right brain. Okay? So that's the difference. People wondering, oh, wait, I thought air was mind. Air is intellect. It's a specific part of the mind. Those elements that are associated with the left brain, left hemispheric functions in brain lateralization, if we're using that model. Mercury is left brain and right brain. It's the mind, it's imagination, it's thinking, etc. And a good way to remember this is that Mercury is actually made up of two elements. So Mercury is made up of air and water. And this makes sense because air, remember, represents intellect and left brain functions, and water is associated with typically right brain functions, intuition, the deep waters of the unconscious. It's also associated with emotions. So you can see that Mercury isn't just air, it's air and water, left brain, right brain. Okay? So this is what Mercury represents as the soul. And what about spirit? So what's the difference here? Oh, and one other thing that I want to mention is that Mercury is considered androgynous. Fire is considered masculine. In some systems, Mercury will be described as feminine and fire is masculine. However, it, in my opinion, makes much more sense for Mercury to be androgynous. And I don't want to overload you with information, but in later steps, you will see why. I'll give you a little bit of preview of why, but you'll see why. Okay? I mean, one way to understand this real quick, is that guess what? Water is feminine and air is masculine, and Mercury is both of these things. So Mercury is androgynous. It's neither masculine nor feminine. It's both. So it's androgynous. Okay? So let's talk about let's talk about spirit in terms of sulfur. So what is spirit? Spirit is our inner force that drives our consciousness upwards. It's our inner drive. It's what drives us towards enlightenment. It's the soul's power. It's will, but not just standard will. This is the will to find a higher purpose. Okay? So that's very important to understand. This is your will to find a higher purpose. Your will to connect to the divine. That you can think of like fire, how it's rising, it's trying to go up, it's trying to reach to the divine. And a good way to remember this is that what is sulfur made of? Sulfur is made of air and fire. Because remember, it's not just will. If it were just will, it would just be fire. But it's not. It's fire and air. And so what this represents is a inner drive, an inner fire to reach higher levels of consciousness. Because remember, air represents the left brain functions, which is represented by the consciousness, and water is right brain functions, represented with the unconscious. But you don't have the unconscious here, you have consciousness here. So you have the fiery drive and will towards reaching higher levels of consciousness. this is what represents sulfur. Okay, so sulfur is spirit, the inner fiery drive to higher levels of consciousness. The soul, or Mercury, is your mind in total. Not necessarily a drive towards higher consciousness. It's simply your mind. So the goal of fermentation is to unite these two together. It's to unite Mercury and sulfur, to marry Mercury and sulfur together. And what's really cool about this is that you can even understand this in terms of their elements, because remember, what is Mercury? It's water and air. And what is sulfur? It is air and fire. Thus, they share a common element. Thus, they are able to be united because they have this commonality that they share that allows for their connection. And so what does it mean to unite these two together? What it means to unite these two together is to organize your mind so that your mind is consciously working towards reaching higher levels of consciousness and your true purpose. This is why we're in the realm of the spiritual domain. This is the realm of spirit, because we are using everything that we've learned to find our true divine purpose, to be reborn at a higher level. And so once again, uniting Mercury and sulfur is the goal of this phase, which is uniting soul and spirit, mind, and the drive to higher levels of consciousness, imagination, and will. All of these things are being connected together. You want these working together, because without it, Mercury can just wander off and do its own thing and get totally distracted and not be achieving higher levels of consciousness. And spirit, when it's not combined with Mercury, can just be lost in your unconscious forever, just in the background, never actually actualizing. You never discover your true inner fire. You never bring it in to your consciousness. Okay, so these are the primes. These are the different elements that we're working with. And now it might make a little more sense as to why we have the planet Mercury, because the planet Mercury, as I said before, represents the idea of communication and the mind and intellect. That's what the planet Mercury is all about. Ideas, communication, but it can often not be directed, or it can be distracted by the ego. So that's also, by the way, Mercury is Hermes. Mercury is Hermes. And what does Hermes have? The caduceus. And the caduceus is a very powerful symbol. Where here I have it. It's not exactly a caduceus, but it's very close. Where you have the two serpents, and then you have this central rose. In a typical caduceus, though, it would be two serpents wrapping around a staff. And so the two serpents represent Mercury and sulfur, and then the staff in the middle represents salt. We're going to get to that later, okay? But spoiler alert, salt represents body. So the staff of Hermes can represent, alchemically speaking, the unification of mind, body, and spirit. So we have Mercury as the planet associated with this. We also have the metal Mercury, and the Mercury is a totally fascinating metal because it can shift between liquid, solid, and vapor. At room temperature, it's the only metal that's liquid at room temperature, which is super cool. Now, if you get to extremely cold temperatures, it'll become a solid. And then if you heat it up, it'll evaporate into a gas. Never do this. It's extremely toxic and highly dangerous. It can kill you. So don't do that. But it has that capacity to be a solid, a liquid, or it can evaporate into a gas. And so you see it's very fluid. This is another reason why it's the androgynous metal, because it can shift. It's very fluid and can shift into these different forms. So this is what's going to ultimately as well, as we'll see later, Mercury is also what allows to connect the spirit and the body. So Mercury is it's the connector. Okay, Mercury will be able to connect with spirit, and Mercury will be able to connect with salt, which is the body. We're not getting to that part yet, but just so you know, and this is because it's represented by, or this is why we represent it with the metal Mercury, because metal can be solid, which is representative of body, liquid, which is representative of mind or soul, and vapor, which is representative of spirit. Now, it's not all three of those, but it contains the elements to connect to those things, as we will see. Okay. So I know this is kind of a lot. This is a lot more than the typical steps, but that's because we're moving from the elemental realm to the spiritual realm. And now we're working with the primes instead of the elements. And there's a lot here. And we're working with, normally we just work with one element, but now we're in the fifth element of spirit, and we're working with two primes. We're working with Mercury and sulfur together to combine them together to align our mind with our spirit, or our consciousness with our purpose, our power self. Now, we're going to get into what the power self is and how to actualize it in the stage of fermentation. But before I do, there's just one other thing that I want to talk to you guys about with regard to these symbols here. So let's see. This is what we're trying to unify in the step of fermentation. But remember, putrefaction comes before this. And remember, I always like to associate tarot cards with these steps to help illustrate what's going on here. So putrefaction, we associate with the death tarot card. Now, we associate it with the death tarot card because death is about the destruction of the old. People think the death card is like, oh, that's such a bad card. It's not necessarily a bad card. It just means that the old is going to pass away, which, guess what, can make way for something new. So now in alchemy, putrefaction is often represented by, like, again, decay, the rotting flesh, the corpse of the old self. So death is about the destruction of the old so that the new can be reborn. And it's interesting, there's a lot of symbolism in this card. We don't have time to go over all of it, but there's a lot of beautiful symbolism. And you can even see in the background, what's really interesting about this sun is this sun can either be setting or rising. It depends on your perspective. You can think of it as the sun dying, as in setting, or rising, making way for something new. So putrefaction is represented by the death tarot card, but death is not a bad thing. It means the passing away of the old. So what does death mean? Death means the passing away of the old and the promise of something new, the promise of rebirth. So that's the putrefaction stage. The stage that comes next is represented by judgment. So in judgment, this is did I say fermentation? Hopefully I did. This is fermentation is associated with judgment. So death is putrefaction, then fermentation is judgment. And you can see it fits very well. Death is the passing away of the old, and judgment is the rebirth, being born again. Now, what's the difference between these two cards? Death is the passing away of something old and the promise of something new. Judgment is that something new. Judgment is the phoenix being reborn. It's also like the alarm clock as well. It's like telling you, hey, wake up, time to wake up. This is why you have these people getting up out of their graves. And they're also looking up towards an angelic being or a divine being representing higher consciousness as well. So we have the death of the old and the birth of the new. If we wanted to as well, this isn't like a typical association, but it is kind of interesting that you have a male, a female, and a child. We could certainly represent this as Mercury, spirit, and salt, mind, body, and soul. That's kind of interesting that we have that triad here. So these are the cards that represent these two steps. So let's start talking about how now. Hopefully that all makes sense. I know it's a lot of info. So in summary, the fermentation stage has two stages: putrefaction and fermentation. Putrefaction is about making sure that you don't have any ego inflation and letting it decay and die if you do. And also making sure that you are integrating the other aspects of your unconscious shadow self and mirror self so it doesn't contaminate your power self. That's putrefaction. Fermentation is stepping into your power self, being reborn and discovering your power self, which is your true purpose, not just any old purpose, but your divine purpose. And this is representative of unifying the substances of Mercury and sulfur, mind and spirit together so that they are aligned towards higher consciousness and uncontaminated by egoic inflation or shadow content or mirror content or unconscious content that hasn't been properly integrated. So let's talk a little more about the shadow self or the power self, because it might seem a little abstract. So I'm going to read to you some excerpts from my book, Psychogenesis, because I talk in detail about the power self in Psychogenesis. We do not have time to go into all of its intricacies here, but let's just get a brief overview so we know what we're talking about. So remember, power self, this is a step of fermentation, combining Mercury and sulfur to find our true purpose, our divine purpose. And it's coming very close to our inner star. Anyway, let me just read. So having explored the shadow and mirror selves, which we did in the last two steps, we now arrive at the blazing core of our inner universe, the power self. Now, as the shadow self is composed of the parts of you that were repressed, and the mirror self are the parts of you that are your inner opposite, your power self contains your highest potential, your inner power. It's the source of your fire and will. By the way, do you see how in Psychogenesis I'm describing the process of alchemy just without using those words? I'm putting it more in psychological terms. Anyway, I'm just throwing that out there to show you that this is powerful psychology. So an integrated power self will give you godlike control over your life and allow you to inspire others. It gives you, when you're really activating your power self, others will be inspired by you. Because of its extreme power, it's the most dangerous archetype to integrate. So remember, the shadow self is the most frightening to integrate. The mirror self is the most difficult to integrate. The power self is the most dangerous to integrate. Why? Because as you approach the power self, you're coming exceedingly close to the inner star. And the inner star is your true self, your higher self. The power self is not equivalent to your higher self, because remember, the power self can get contaminated and end up serving the ego or being contaminated by the shadow self or the mirror self or other unconscious content. So the power self isn't what you are. You're all, or I'm sorry, the power self isn't what you are. You're the inner star. You're all of it. But the power self is coming it's the fiery core of it, basically. Not all of it, but like the fiery core of it. It's the source of your hidden strength, and it contains your ability to transform your life and the world. It's the key to will forming, giving form to what you will. At its core, the power self contains the unconscious desires and ambitions that we hold for ourselves that yearn for development and expression. It's the latent potential within us, the parts of ourselves and our capability that's waiting to be realized and actualized. In short, your power self represents all the things you unconsciously want to become. It's that inner drive for evolution, but divine evolution, purposeful transformation. Not just like, oh, I want to make a lot of money or I want to be super popular. No, it's divine purpose. And if, making money and being popular is part of it, fine. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with that unless you're, a billionaire asshole, but you get what I'm saying. It's more than that. Not that those things are bad. They can be, but not necessarily. So it's the drive for meaning and purpose. And so how can we understand this better? So remember, often these unconscious content gets projected. So in shadow self-projection, that's when we see the stuff we don't like about ourselves in others and then hate others because of it. The typical example of this is if you have, think of the bro, manly, masculine guy who unconsciously has homosexual urges, but represses that. And so they hate anyone who's gay because they go, because it psychologically eases that discomfort because they're like, oh, look how much I hate gay people. I possibly couldn't be gay. That's horrible, of course, but that's what shadow self-projection can do. There's mirror self-projection and there's power self-projection as well. So what's power self-projection? So people tend to see traits they unconsciously desire or admire in themselves in others. So for instance, someone might be drawn to a public figure's charisma, creativity, or leadership skills because these are qualities that they actually unconsciously want to develop in themselves. So this admiration or connection stems from the qualities of their power self that they haven't yet realized or integrated. So this can lead to individuals idealizing certain people like celebrities, leaders, or even fictional characters who embody these traits. Now, this isn't necessarily bad. Inspiration is great. But when that inspiration instead becomes worship and hinders our growth, inspiration should inspire you to better yourself, not to worship someone. So there's nothing wrong with being inspired. That's great. But most people, when they're power self-projecting aren't just inspired, they turn it into worship. And then they're not actualizing it in themselves because they're just so fascinated by it in that other person or even fantasy character. So instead of cultivating their own inner strengths and qualities and potential for greatness, this happens in religion. You can project it onto a god. Very common in religion for power self-projection. You're projecting your own inner divinity onto an external entity that's not even real, a god. In worshiping a god, individuals are admiring the unacknowledged parts of their power self. The god becomes a symbol of all the power, wisdom, nurturing, and care and love and capabilities they unconsciously want to embody. So they're externalizing their potential for divinity instead of stepping into their potential for divinity. That's what power self-projection is. Instead of realizing the divinity in yourself, when you're in a religion and worshiping a god, you're projecting your divinity onto something else and then worshiping that something else rather than actualizing it into yourself. What can also happen? This can also happen in terms of politics. So in politics can lead to the rise of authoritarian and fascist regimes. This is when individuals project their own desires for strength and control and certainty onto political leaders or ideologies. And so they can even relinquish their power, relinquish their freedoms to this figure that represents their god, essentially. Now, here's something that I want to really make clear. Okay, so that's the importance of understanding. I think power self-understanding projection can often help you understand like what this actually is, what this actually entails. But here's something I want to remind you. This is important, that your power self isn't necessarily just what one would normally associate with power. Okay? It's not just about like assertiveness. It can be, but not necessarily. Your power self is just the unconscious aspect of yourself that you want to manifest. So this can include traits that are not conventionally seen as quote unquote powerful in the typical sense, but they actually are. So here's some examples. Humor. In this, if you admire comedians, think about or the funny characters in movie. You like to bring joy and laughter to people. Nurturing, the capacity for nurture, the capacity for care, supporting others. Creativity, rebelliousness, intelligence, emotional intelligence, compassion. So I want to make it clear that power isn't necessarily like, oh, dominating others. It's your power, and your power can manifest in many different ways. It can manifest as assertiveness. Hopefully you're doing it in a positive way, if so, or nurture or care or love or empathy or humor or creativity. Any of these things. So we want to be very careful not to have our power selves be contaminated. So like an example of someone with a contaminated power self is I don't even know if I can say this name on YouTube. The World War II mustache man. You know who I'm referring to. Him. So he's an example of someone who has accessed his power self, but is extremely psychologically imbalanced. So a lot of charisma, inspiring others, but in a very negative way, because it got infected by ego inflation and very likely shadow self as well, likely infected it. And this led to hatred, xenophobia, and destruction, because the unaddressed psychological issues translated into these policies and actions that brought about immense suffering and loss of life. Is there anyone else we can think of that matches that description today? I don't know. Can you maybe possibly think of that? I don't know. Anyway, if we're talking about fictional characters, Darth Vader and Sauron are good examples of those who have accessed their power self, but haven't integrated their shadow or got rid of their ego inflation. Now, if we're talking about balanced archetypes in fiction, examples of balanced, well-integrated archetypes that have accessed their power self are Gandalf, Galadriel, and Luke Skywalker. They're very balanced, and they're using their power with wisdom and empathy and the good for all. So that's how we can understand a balanced power self here. So how do we actually go about doing this? Well, this is something that is going to take, some people it might come easy. Some people it might take time. Because remember, these steps aren't necessarily linear. So it might be that as you begin to understand yourself better and understand what existence is better, you will naturally begin to realize your power self, because you are clearing the blockages and creating that pathway to it. So it can be something that gradually develops over time through understanding yourself and reality better. But here is an exercise to get the ball rolling. Now, I know that like last week, I gave you guys an exercise for the mirror self. Obviously, you guys can't, it's impossible to do this stuff in just a week. So all this stuff is a lifetime of work. So I'm not expecting you to do, last week you integrated your mirror self and today you're going to integrate your power self. No, you don't have to do it that quickly. But when you are ready, here is an exercise to get the ball rolling. So list 5 people that inspire you. Get a piece of paper and list 5 people. And you know what you can do on that piece of paper as well is draw the symbol for Mercury and draw the symbol for sulfur, and then put a circle around both of them, showing that you're uniting them. And that can just be a nice way to psychologically reinforce what you're doing. Okay. But what you want to do is make a list of 5 people or even things that inspire you. It can be real people, historical figures, celebrities, family members, doesn't matter. It can be fictional characters, like I mentioned. And it doesn't even have to be like, if you are inspired by, let's say, Darth Vader or Sauron, that's fine. There's no judgment here. Just put down what actually inspires you. This doesn't mean you're going to want to be exactly like these people. Of course, you don't want to be like Darth Vader or Sauron, obviously. They're psychopathic murderers. You don't want to do that. But this is just about putting down what inspires you. It can be real people, can be fictional people. It can even be abstract ideas like philosophies or certain movements, etc. So just as an example, you could put down Leonardo da Vinci, Carl Jung, Alan Watts, the phoenix, the symbol, the idea of the phoenix, and alchemy. Let's say you can do those 5 things just as examples. And then what you're going to want to do is for each one of those 5, for each one, list 10 traits that you admire about each. So pick one that you admire. So let's say Alan Watts, his curiosity, his observation of reality, intuitive thinking, passion for mystery and hidden knowledge, a lifelong learner, etc., etc. Just do some reflection and try and list 10 things for each of the 5 that you listed. Now what you're doing is you're looking for patterns and overlapping traits. You're looking for commonalities. Look at all 5 lists and highlight traits that appear more than once or that are at least very similar to each other. And these are qualities that obviously resonate with you a lot. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean for sure. Remember last time I gave the mirror self example and how you can get it started? Doesn't mean for sure that's your mirror self, but it helps get things started. It helps get the ball rolling. This can help get the ball rolling, help get things started with discovering your power self. Find out the commonalities, find out what resonates with you across these different examples. And these recurring themes, these recurring patterns can be pointing towards your core essence. That is things that you unconsciously want to develop in yourself. So connecting with your power self is about discovering what that is and then actualizing it, like actually manifesting it, actually taking the steps to cultivate that within yourself. And remember, when it comes to integration, this is all about being the detective of your own self. No one can tell you I can't tell you what your power self is. I can't tell you what your mirror self is. I can't tell you what your shadow self is. And that's what a lot of people are looking for. They just want to, go to someone for answers. They want to go to a tarot card reader for answers. They want to go to an astrologer for answers. They want to go to a god for answers. They want to go to a YouTuber for answers. No. I mean, certain things can guide you and help you, but ultimately you have to do the work yourself because it's your unconscious and it's unique to you. So you have to play the detective that's doing the inner work. And so you have to discover what your power self is. This is a helpful exercise to get the ball rolling, to discover your power self. And once you do start to begin to discover your power self, you want to actualize it and start cultivating that within yourself. Okay? Now, one last thing that I want to remind you is that remember, integration is not identification. You don't want to identify with your power self. The power self is just part of you. It's a very important part of you, but it's just a part of you. And by the way, when you start integrating all these aspects together, it's going to start to align towards your inner star. We're going to talk about that in the next step, because the next step is when we finally connect to the inner star, your higher self. That's the next step. But this step is about the power self. So remember, integration is not identification. It's about getting that aspect of you to work with all the other aspects of you in an integrated, holistic way, not allowing it to dominate. Because if your power self dominates, if you identify with it, it can cause a lot of damage because it's not your whole self and it's not healthy. Even if it's like empathy and love and care, because empathy, love, and care that goes out of control can be smothering. Any of these aspects that are your power self, if they just totally dominate and get out of control, can end up harming. So it's always important to remember, integration is not identification. It's not who you are. It's a part of you. And this is often, if you do identify with the power self, that's called power self possession. There's shadow possession, mirror possession, power self possession. None of these are good. You don't want to identify, because you don't want to identify with your ego, right? You don't want to identify with your shadow. These are all different aspects of you, not the whole you. The power self is just a very powerful part that inspires drive towards purpose and meaning, especially higher levels of purpose and meaning. Remember, we're in the element of spirit here. We're in the element of purpose and meaning towards our true purpose and will, not just like I said, like, oh, I want to make a lot of money or be super famous, or that's just a desire. That's not the same thing as what we're talking about here. This is on a much higher level. So as a reminder, this is what we're working with here at this level. The planet Mercury, the metal Mercury, the element of spirit. I don't have the symbol for the element of spirit, but the element of spirit is going to be throughout all three. And I'll put the symbol for the element of spirit in the notes, in the alchemical notes that I make for this video. But that, that's there. And then in addition to that, we have the primes. We have the prime of Mercury and the prime of sulfur. The goal is to unify these together. First, we do putrefaction, which is getting rid of ego inflation, as well as making sure that we are integrating the aspects of our unconscious. And then fermentation, which is where we unify these two together, represented by judgment, where we are awakening to our true power and beginning that first step of awakening and becoming very close to the inner star, which brings us to what we're going to be talking about next week. Next week is the sixth step, which is distillation, which is forging that connection directly to the inner star, now that we have all these aspects together. So as always, if you have any questions, if you have any things that you need clarified, let me know in the comments. I will be making my notes for this video and all the other steps available to anyone who's a member for free. If you want to purchase them, you can as well. There, to do that is in the link in the description. Also, check out my book, Psychogenesis, Self and Universal Transformation, for more information on everything we're talking about here, just not in alchemical language. And yeah, so that is what death and resurrection is actually about here. And it's critical. It's important. And I want to give a big shout out to everyone who supports, by the way. Big shout out to Renaissance Fairy, Cassidy, Angela, DB, Nusalina, Dallas, Sacred Moth, and everyone else. Thank you very much.